Hi guys, my name is Oded, and in this podcast we'll speak about software development in the field of medical device, pharmaceuticals, and healthcare with industry-leading experts. I hope you'll find this content useful. Let's start. Mr. Bradley Thompson, thank you so much for taking the time to participate in the podcast. Before we dive in to the topic of regulatory submissions and a bit of modern medical device with AI features, and maybe you can tell us a bit about yourself, your professional background.
Sure. So I'm an American medical device lawyer. And what that means is I focus on FDA regulation. My office is in Washington, D.C., but I work remotely, quite honestly. I've been doing this about 35 years. In the last 10 years or so, I've been focused on software. As a part of that, I have a special focus on clinical decision support. We represented a group called the Clinical Decision Support Coalition for about 8 or 9 years. Trying to improve the FDA regulatory environment. We worked with the agency and we worked with Congress. And with Congress, we got a significant piece of legislation passed in 2016 that changed the way FDA regulated software. I'm sort of all in on this, even though I'm getting up there in age. I'm a graduate student at the University of Michigan working on a master's in data science. This is July of 2021. God willing, in December, I'll graduate. Finally, be about 3 years working on it. I've got a major capstone project that I'm doing in this space. So I'm really interested in the AI piece and love what I'm doing. So that's my background.
Fascinating. That's really... I can't think of a better person to help us understand this topic. So let's
do my best.
Let's have a use case or some role play just to maybe understand the topic from that angle. Let's say I'm your colleague from the university and I'm a genius data scientist, biomedical, and I've wrote this Python code, and now I've created a decision support system, like you called it, or whatever software that helps diagnose a condition, medical condition, or maybe suggest some treatment. What do I do with that? I mean, from all the spectrum of regulation, also from submitting it and enabling a doctor a medical practitioner to use it, and also from maybe a bit of commercial side. How do I patent it? Can I patent it? Or let's have a broader look about it.
Well, the first thing I'd have to share with you is that my hope is that you would have called me before you did too much work, development work, because there's things that I can do to help early in the development stage, which are just more difficult, more expensive, honestly, if you come to me later. So let's say you came to me relatively early in the process of developing this. The first conversation we would have is whether it's going to be and whether it needs to be FDA regulated at all, right? So this is a conversation I have a couple times a week with some startup company or some university developer. I do a lot of work. I serve as general counsel to a group called AI in Health Coalition. And that coalition is focused specifically on AI. The prior coalition was broadly for all clinical decision support, whether AI-based or not. So I talk to university people all the time. And the first conversation is, look, there are 4 ways that you can avoid FDA altogether. And if you can avoid FDA, it's going to be better for you, at least right now. And what I mean by that is, COVID has changed the world. And one of the things that you might expect is that FDA has been just inundated with work related to COVID. So last year, 2020, in addition to their normal work of people trying to get new software, new medical devices approved, they had this huge amount of work associated with COVID. And that didn't come with any more user fees because it was all done on an emergency basis. They had to shift resources from what they were doing, their normal work, to deal with the thousands, literally thousands of requests for emergency approval of products, whether it was software, which was a small piece of it, but more likely in vitro diagnostic testing, personal protective equipment. So FDA is trying to deal with all of that in addition to the normal workload. This is a horrible time to try to go to FDA to get a new product cleared or approved. Maybe 2022, it'll be better, but 2021 is still bad at FDA. They're still trying to dig their way out of that massive amount of work. So the first conversation I have is, do you want to try and go to market without going through FDA? And as I said, generally speaking, there are 4 ways to do that. And I'm just going to summarize it because it's a long conversation. Number 1 would be trying to avoid being a medical device at all by avoiding making medical type claims and using medical type functionality. There are certain areas where this is possible and certain areas where it's not. If it's meant to guide surgery, there's really nothing you can do. That's going to be medical. But if it can sort of more be focused on other aspects and not make claims for the cure or diagnosis of disease or other conditions in man. And be aware that the word diagnosis, for example, is read very broadly to include things like screening and monitoring and so forth, or recommending a therapeutic intervention. So if you can avoid that, great. A lot of companies can't, but some can. The second possibility, and this is related, is that you can even mention a disease if you do it in a wellness context. So if the software is about telling people how to live a healthier life with a disease, or to reduce the risk that they will incur a disease down the road, then there's a FDA guidance called the Wellness Guidance. It was published in 2019, 2 years ago, or republished, I should say. And you can get into disease-related claims, but so long as your intervention is a lifestyle intervention, you can avoid FDA. The third option is low-risk uses. And FDA has said that there are certain software functionalities that even though they qualify as a medical device, they are so low risk that we don't want to take our time and your money to review them. And so they've created numerous specific categories. A lot of these are contained in guidance documents. There's a general software guidance document that was again republished the same September 19 date. Go and read that document. It has all sorts of different specific areas where FDA has said we're not going to bother regulating. The fourth is perhaps the most relevant to this conversation. The fourth is what this Clinical Decision Support Coalition fought for in Congress. And it is what Congress enacted in 2016, specific to clinical decision support. And what it says is if the software is transparent enough to reveal the basis for a recommendation, the software won't be regulated. It won't be considered a medical device. So you have to provide in the software some practical means of the person understanding and being able to consult whatever that basis is to sort of double check whatever the software is recommending. And if you do that, you can avoid FDA regulation. That's why one of the reasons I said it's great if people talk to me early, because if they know that, it can influence their design decisions as to even what form of machine learning, what model they choose to use, because some are more explainable than others. They may not perform as well, but there's differences in the degree to which they're explainable.
The last point is the one I was like a bit feeling uncomfortable with. So I was saying, hold on, machine learning, that's the whole idea, is that we are taking 300 variables and it finds its way to make a suggestions. And then it's very hard to explain because there are so many variables in the analysis.
I don't agree with that completely.
Okay.
You don't have to replicate what the model is doing in your brain to necessarily understand what it is doing. There are some forms of machine learning models that are more readily understandable. A decision tree is a model that I can wrap my head around. There may be a lot of variables, but, and again, this goes to design. If I am clear, if I use the software and say, these are the inputs, these are the variables, you can look at them, right? Mm-hmm. And so I click on a link and all that data is there. I can double check it for accuracy. It says that the patient is a man. Is the patient a man? It's, and go right through and check all the inputs. And on the outputs, you can use, there are libraries that make some machine learning algorithms more understandable because they identify the factors that the machine was persuaded by in arriving at the decision. So I'll use, for an example, line as a way of explaining natural language processing by identifying the key words, the words that pushed the model in this direction, the words that push the model in this direction. I can look at it, and if it's gibberish, then I'm going to say, okay, maybe the computer's right, but it would be dumb luck if it was. I need to dig deeper. I need to understand more. But maybe that explanation comes back and it says, here are the factors that drove it this way, and here are the factors. And I look at it and say, yeah, those are the correct factors. And so I can understand how the machine is pushing it one way or another. So this is Brad talking. This isn't FDA. FDA hasn't put this in writing, but I'm interpreting a statute that Congress enacted. And I do think there are some machine learning models that lend themselves to transparency. You're right, a neural network, maybe not. But let's look at image analysis. In image analysis, if image analysis basically just says, look at this spot on the image. This is what I, the computer, am focused on. Okay, I'll look at that spot. And if that spot is concerning to me as a radiologist, okay, that's useful, right? But that's pretty transparent. I know exactly the spot on the image that the algorithm was concerned about. I look at it myself and I reach my own professional opinion. Unfortunately, FDA insisted when the legislation was enacted that image analysis not be included. So it's a poor example, but I'm just illustrating for you that there are creative ways to think about transparency that may well, for non-image analysis software, allow us to claim exemption.
Right. So, but that's very fascinating, because that's kind of saying we can't look at machine learning as a black box. We throw something in and something came out. If we want to enable be able not to go on the medical device route, then we have to really understand and be able to communicate that as an output. How did we reach the decision? But that's not a bit in contradiction. You still don't feel that that's a bit in contradiction with the idea of machine learning, because otherwise it would just be a simple mathematical equation. That's not what we are referring to a machine learning, isn't it?
I don't agree. Machine learning can be overwhelming for two reasons. One is that you don't understand the math that's going on. And the other is that the data set is too big for me to know all of the variables that it considered, right? So let's just take those independently. The machine learning model, I just explained, some of them are more transparent than others. Right. Logistic regression isn't that complicated to understand what it's doing. I can wrap my head around that and understand it. You're right that there are a lot of variables that it might look at. But frankly, for most medical applications, while you might train it on a bunch of data, the data you have on a certain patient is reasonably limited. And the machine ought to be able to show you whatever the data was that influenced the mathematical model, because there's an electronic health record or whatever it might be. But a lot of these will be on a couple of lab results and a couple other things. The model will make its prediction. It isn't a million variables. Now, I mean, if you get into the realm of natural language processing, it might look at an entire text file, But even there, it can point you to the portion of the text file that persuaded it one way or another. So the fact that there is potentially a lot of data, if you design the algorithm well enough and make it explainable so it points to exactly the data that it considered most relevant, that goes a long way toward explainability.
Right. This example and the example with the image, even if that doesn't specifically example, you really emphasize, I mean, why not? I mean, there's no risk. It's just an extra stage. It's not replacing the doctor and saying there is no doctor and then making that decision. If we want to do it without the doctor, then I guess we would be in the medical device.
Right. Autonomous AI in a medical context will be regulated. There's just no escaping that. And you'll have to prove that it works as well as it needs to work autonomously. And that'll be a higher standard of proof, quite honestly, because you won't have the risk mitigation of a human in the loop. So yes, if it's autonomous, expect it to be, frankly, heavily regulated.
And do you feel that from the conversation that you have, most decision support system that people approach you with, they fall under those categories, that they are not medical device based on the current regulation? Or not really?
You know, a lot of people who are coming to me are still not using a neural network or something, deep learning. I still get a lot of very garden variety. You may not even call them artificial intelligence. They're simple models that are part expert system with maybe a little AI thrown in. And a lot of those can be designed to be transparent. So yeah, a lot of people who come to me, we're able to figure out a way to make it transparent. I understand the trend is towards deep learning. I get that, and it'll be much more of a challenge. But you know, there's smart researchers at universities in Israel and the US who are really working on more explainable models. That is, they're deliberately designing the model with explainability as a design criteria for the model. You know, our military is actually leading the charge in that, because certain AI used in a military context, they want a human in the loop. You know, if you're going to attack somebody, you better make sure that a human's okay with it. So the military is funding quite a bit of explainability research. So I'm very optimistic that a lot of that can be repurposed to medicine and be very explainable in medicine.
Fantastic. And so let's say we are unfortunate and we have to go through submission. I mean,
Right.
What are the different routes? I mean, we have 510K. I know there's other submission forms. Even 510K. Are there any other similar products? How do you look for similar products?
Right. Your first question, if we fail and you are regulated, the first question is, how is the product classified? And classification is a matter of looking at like 1900, I think at this point, FDA classifications. They're all found in the regulations, Code of Federal Regulations, available to anyone with an internet connection. And the challenge is that those often are written in a somewhat vague and general way. Some of them are quite old. Some of them date from the 1980s, and they were written without sort of software in mind. And so the way you interpret them is seeing how FDA has interpreted them by going into the FDA 510K database and looking at products that they've cleared in those different categories to see if they include software, to see if they include artificial intelligence software. So all of that is very transparent. It's all in a database. The search feature is not very elegant. The search feature is right out of the 1980s, but you know, you can make do with it. But you try and find a predicate device that is substantially similar to yours. But this is where the real challenge is for AI, because FDA is more and more preferring, rather than repurpose an old classification, that you create a new that is specially tailored to an AI use. So if you talk to FDA about whether you fit in a classification, you can arrange a meeting, and you can do it by telephone. You can talk to FDA and say, this is what we want to do. This is the classification we think applies, and therefore we want to go the 510K route, and you can get their reaction as to whether or not they agree. If they don't agree, then you're forced to create a new classification. And, the Latin de novo means, first of a kind, new product. You have to go to them in the de novo process. And the reason you should never prefer the de novo process is that it is a longer, more cumbersome process, typically requires more clinical evidence because they're creating a whole classification and they want to know what the safety and effectiveness profile of these type of devices are. So they'll ask you to do, the clinical trial, and then they'll create a classification, but it might take twice as long to go through, and be substantially more expensive, more demanding in terms of the clinical validation. But those are your options. There are some publications out there that are sort of tracking artificial intelligence clearances at FDA. I know there's one, it's a European website, as I recall, but they're trying to keep an up-to-date list of AI that goes through the FDA 510K process or the de novo process. You might go there and see exactly where other products are, but there are ways to sort of research what the possibilities are.
But I just want to ask you about a specific issue that you mentioned. When you look at something similar, do you look for something similar, product similar that use the same algorithm, or it is used for the same diagnostic?
There are two criteria, basically, two criteria. One is that it have the same intended use, which means generally it's used for the same intended use, not necessarily at a specific indication wording, because you can change the intended use statement in some ways. To typically if it's professional use, it's hard to change it to consumer or patient use. There are certain things that are very difficult, but if it's in the same general category, you're okay on intended use. And the other is the same fundamental technology. And FDA would consider sort of any machine learning algorithm to be within the class of same general technology. So they don't have to necessarily have used, a decision tree methodology or model, for example, and you want to use deep learning. That's not going to cause consternation. But it ought to be at least a machine learning model, typically.
I know it depends the answer, but just a ball game number. I mean, what are we looking at here in terms of, that colleague that came with that idea that now has to go through a 510K or even a de novo? What is it from? Just a bit of numbers, time, very rough numbers.
Let's talk about time first. It's relatively typical for a 510K to require 2 rounds of FDA review, especially now. The FDA will review it typically in 90 days. They'll come up with their list of questions. You'll have, maybe 20 days or so to respond to their questions. And then they'll take another 90 days to do it. So 200 days, over 6 months is very common in the 510K world for the FDA review. That is in addition to whatever pre-discussions you might have with FDA. So if you want to meet with them first, talk to them to try and figure out what needs to be in the 510K, make sure a 510K is going to work, that sort of thing. You can expect to add another 90 days to the front of that process. So easily, 3/4 of a year. The de novo process is much less predictable. They're trying to get the actual review time, which is the active review time at the FDA, under 150 days. But it's not unusual to go beyond that. And for some really complicated and novel things, it's going to be even more. So you've got that, and you probably have, with a de novo, at least 1 meeting with FDA, if not 2 meetings. My experience is they often like to have a couple meetings. The first meeting is just sort of where they do a basic learning and the high level stuff. And the second meeting sort of gets down to the details a little bit more. So that can easily be, 180 days in advance of meeting with FDA, talking to them and getting ready for that submission. So that's why I said, it's very conceivable that it could be twice as much time to go through the de novo as it is the other. in terms of cost, the big cost driver in both is the development of the evidence. Whether you have to do a clinical trial, how big it is, how well powered it needs to be, how many sites you need to have, that sort of thing. That's the biggest cost driver. And, it actually may be, you could end up having to do that same level of clinical study in a 510K if FDA wants it. But you have to figure it might be a little bit more involved, just given the novelty of it, because what you're proving is the safety and effectiveness of basically the category of devices, where in the 510K, you're really just trying to prove that you work as well as whatever the predicate device is. So my experience is the clinical evidence for de novos is bigger, more patients, more complexity, because it's trying to cover an entire category of products. So again, I don't know, double, but twice. The actual cost of the submission, a lot of 510Ks get written, if you hire a regulatory consultant, it can be anywhere from, depending on complexity, from $30,000 to $50,000. A de novo is more labor intensive, so you probably have to figure anywhere from 50 to 150 for some of them that really drag on multiple years and everything. So it can be a lot more regulatory manpower required for the de novo as well.
Okay, but let's say we pay that money, we are approved, yes, celebration. Now all the idea with machine learning is that once we get more data, we improve the algorithm. We get more data, the physicians are using our tool, and now we want to continuously update our algorithm. Do we have to go through the same clinical process again? Is it just, I know there's something called letter to file. Is it just a letter to file and we release a new algorithm? Maybe it completely changed after we got the additional data.
So the first thing you need to do is make sure that you're familiar with I think it's a 2018 now, guidance document from FDA on deciding when to submit a 510K for changes in software. It's a guidance document specific to software, and it's specific to the question you just asked, which is, when do changes trigger the need for a new 510K? It's over 30 pages long. I can't possibly summarize the whole thing here, but it's pretty detailed. I mean, it's over 30 pages long. So they go through all the typical kind of changes that you might make, and they identify those that are low risk, where FDA is willing to say, just go do it, validate it, but go do it. You don't need our blessing in a 510K. And then those where it raises issues of the kind that FDA wants to look at before you make the change. The one thing to keep in mind, not one thing, but a thing to keep in mind as you look at it, is you always have to be thinking about cumulatively, since the last submission, all of the changes that have been made, do they now, in that cumulative state, trigger the need for a new 510K? Sometimes people forget that. They go through the analysis this month, okay, no 510K. They go through the analysis next month, and they're only looking at the changes from month 2. They don't go back and sort of add them to the prior changes and ask the question again. So you really need to have that mindset. In the area of AI, it's even more fluid than regular software would be. And FDA is struggling with that right now, what to do about that. And they put out a couple of thought papers on the topic, where they've basically said, how about we brainstorm together, or you brainstorm and bring it to us at the time of the original submission, and tell us all the different ways that you think the software needs to be continuously updated or updated. You tell us what parameters you think will need to evolve. You tell us what training you think you need to do to keep it current, and other work that you need to do in order to manage it. Let's identify those. Let's identify preset latitudes, specifications that you have for making changes. And then let's agree on the protocol that you're going to use to validate it and keep current, to make sure that it's still functioning within the safety and effectiveness profile that we want. So what they're doing is they're trying to move to a model where you agree up front, you and the agency agree up front on how the product can evolve, and then you do that. And then if you need to evolve it in a way that was unanticipated or bigger or different or whatever, you got to go back to the agency then and seek clearance for that. Several companies, my understanding, have tried that. FDA doesn't always, they can't, always share what they're doing in a submission. So you have to look at the summaries, the 510K summaries that come out. A couple of these have been in the context of a de novo, and those have their own summaries. So you can read about kind of where some companies have experimented with this. It's pretty thin in terms of detail, but that's the model that FDA is trying to move toward in AI, recognizing exactly what you said, that the value of it is the continuous improvement.
Right. But from what you're saying, to me, it sounds that the FDA is very, I would say, open for a government agency. I mean, it doesn't feel like there's really people there that are really able to consider that it's got some leverage. It's not.
Yes,
very.
I would agree with that. There's some people there who are very forward thinking, who frankly love AI and see the possibility of what it can do to improve healthcare. They do, and there's a lot of people at FDA who struggle with a historical model that when we approve something, we have to know what its risk profile is, and then it's frozen there.
Yeah, it's closed, everything.
So it does require a mind shift for people at FDA, but the folks there who are involved in digital health, who are involved in software, they get it. Now, we also have, regulations and laws and so forth that haven't been updated in this regard, and they have to work within those constraints.
Design control. I mean, this is against design control in a way.
Sure. Well, and FDA is working on good machine learning practices. It's going very slowly, as I understand it. But the idea is to come up with a tailored set of design controls and quality system elements for AI that recognize the importance of the data, the importance of working to make sure that bias doesn't creep into the data, transparency, all of those things that are more unique to this type of medical device. They're trying to develop a set of what I presume ultimately will be regulations, but it is really slow going. And in FDA's defense, we just had COVID. So they lost 2 years of their lives by having to focus on all these other things related to COVID and couldn't really make progress. So we all ought to understand the challenge that they're facing.
Do you feel that this dependency on AI, is it going to put the medical practitioners in some legal concern that they might be exposed to some kind of complaints about their practices, that they've used some machine learning, they didn't really understand how did it make the decision, and as a result, the patient.
Okay, those are two different things, right? AI is not perfect, and everyone needs to understand that it is indeed far from perfect. And so it's a tool that I think just about everyone who studied it at this point believes that the best performance is human plus AI. Not human alone, not AI alone, but human plus AI. That AI can, if nothing else, make you think about things that you maybe have a mental block against considering, or an area where your education is lacking, or whatever it might be. So AI and human, I think, is widely regarded as the best. The problem and kind of the implication in what you just said is, if doctors ever get to the point where they do what the computer says without understanding it, that's not human and AI. That's just AI, right? Because they're saying, well, the AI says I got to do it, so I got to do it, even though I don't understand. That's not human plus AI. So doctors have to understand that they need to continue to do what they're doing, take the input from the AI for what it's worth, use explainability and transparency to really try and understand it. And if they can't defend it, they can't do it. And every client I have includes in labeling, it says, look, AI does well, but it's far from perfect. You, the doctor, got to make the decision. You got to stay actively engaged in deciding what your patient needs. And it would be horrible for a doctor to sit there in court and say, well, I did it, but I didn't really understand why. They get fried.
Right. Well, it's just sometimes, when you've got a decision support system and it does a good job and you're very busy, then it is okay. It's natural that you would start becoming more dependent on that.
And we all have to work against that
system. Yeah, right.
That's not good. That's not good. I know what you're talking about. There are recognized principles that if something's worked 100 times for you, produce the right answer for 100 times, that 101st time, if you're human, you're going to be more likely to say, well, it must be right. We have to work against that. We have to figure out ways to make sure that that doesn't happen, because that's not the best system. That's AI alone, and AI alone is not good.
Okay, I think this also answers maybe another question that is related, and that's us as, let's say, as the software developer, or what's traditionally called the device manufacturer. If we get a complaint from the physician saying, look, your software made a wrong diagnostic, and in the traditional world of medical device, we're thinking, oh, our device has a problem. Maybe we need the field alert. Maybe we need a recall. I mean, maybe here it's kind of inherent within the idea of the statistically based advice that we will have some of those cases.
Of course. Yeah, so it's not unlike other areas where we know when we first market a product statistically that a certain number will fail. So when we get that information in, we absolutely have to put it in context, because you're right. We know before the product is ever marketed that it maybe is 95% accurate. So if occasionally I get a call that says, you know what, it didn't give me the right answer, I have to first understand, well, of course, 5% of the time it won't get the right answer. Now I can't ignore that. I have to track it, and I have to do, if I can, a root cause analysis to figure out what went wrong. Because if nothing else, I shouldn't be complacent. I shouldn't say 95% is good enough and I never want to do better. Every opportunity, every error is an opportunity to improve. I just did a massive program as a part of my course for the second year sort of final exam. And one of the things they have you do is go through a random selection of errors and diagnose why each error was likely to have resulted, so that you can feed that back into the design. So by all means, take that information, learn from it, improve, but it doesn't mean that somehow the product didn't meet expectations. It just means it's an opportunity to improve the product.
Right. Okay, so maybe just a small question. I don't know if that's part of your expertise, but just about kind of also, it's two questions. One of them is, let's say we've created the algorithm. How do we patent it? And if we can, or
no idea.
No idea. So
no idea.
I mean, it's a bit about the commercial side of it. I mean, and the other one is, okay, I have this medical data and I have my Python code or whatever. That how do we bring that to the doctor? I mean, is there kind of tools that help facilitate doctor with a more friendly UI, or is it something that I will now have to build and make it as part of the device? Both is.
But both are outside my area of expertise. Patent law in the US is a special bar. There are people admitted to the patent law bar. I'm not, and I'm not qualified to answer that question. In terms of usability, I have noticed, just because I'm an observer of my clients, that a lot of them have had challenges with physician adoption for any number of reasons. The awkwardness of the user interface, the complexity, the learning curve associated with it, the tediousness of it, the fact that the doctor herself has to do it as opposed to someone else. I just had knee surgery, and my surgeon said a good time is when I'm not in front of the computer. He just hates doing computer work. Surgeons are kind of like that. You know, surgeons, they want to work with their hands.
The sum to everything, right? In one sense.
Yeah. I mean, they didn't go to medical school to sit in front of a computer. So there are a lot of reasons that there's slow adoption among doctors, and people smarter than I'll have to fix or solve those. But I am aware of the challenges. I'm just not aware of the solutions.
So really, just to finish, first of all, to say thank you so much for your generosity, and maybe you can share with the community how can they follow your publications, or if they have similar questions.
You know, I do use LinkedIn to sort of keep my friends apprised of articles that I publish or things that I hear about. It may have nothing to do with me, but just things that I've heard about going on in the industry. So if someone wants to connect with me through LinkedIn, that's generally the best way to keep up to date.
So thank you very much, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed this. Take care.